International Women's Day is celebrated annually on the 8th of March. It marks the social, economic, cultural and political achievements of women while highlighting some of the problems that they continue to face on a day-to-day basis. And of course, the professional and workplace environment is not exempt from that. To speak to us more about this tonight, we're joined by Thabo Mbeki Foundation trustee, Geraldine Fraser-Molekete. Good evening and thank you so much for your time tonight. It's a pleasure to be having this conversation with you. When we holistically take a look at the advancements that women have been able to make, COVID-19, of course, has dealt an incredible blow to some of the things that would have previously been pointed at as successes, because we remain in this pandemic and are likely to emerge out of it with women being the most vulnerable in society and having been dealt economically a very severe blow.
Thank you and good evening, Kathy, to you and your viewership. You are absolutely correct about women having been dealt a blow, but it's not just a blow economically. And let me go to the theme of the day. As you're aware, UN Women in 2021 is focusing on women in leadership, achieving an equal society, equal future in a COVID-19 world. The Thabo Mbeki Foundation, with its International Women's Day focus, deliberately focused on a gendered perspective on a post-COVID-19 world, close quotes. And the reason we had this focus was precisely because we wanted to deal and consider the issues related to the impact of COVID. As we are aware, women are generally part of the care economy. And as pointed out, this is both the commercial care economy as well as the informal and unpaid care economy. And during COVID and over the past year in particular, we've seen additional burdens on women. So in an interesting way, much as there's always been attempts to invisibilize women, there's almost been a greater dependence on women. But what is the reality? If we look at women working in the health sector, generally health workers aren't paid as well as they should be. There's a global statistic that says that women generally earn around 11% less than men. If we look at listed companies, you can virtually count women, and it's well under 10% at this point in time. You again go to the impact of COVID on the larger economy and society, and we found that there's been this debate between lives and livelihoods. And earlier today, at the webinar that the Thabo Mbeki Foundation hosted, there was a very clear call that we should use the opportunity and the challenges presented by COVID-19 to make a change. And some have even compared it to possibly looking at the reality that maybe this change that we are seeing is not revolution, but rather reform. And how do we ensure that women aren't pushed, on the back foot around it? But maybe I should pause, Kathy. You may want to come in, because I also want to make links of the experiences of women in parts of West Africa during Ebola and what we are seeing with COVID that's much more widespread globally.
And it's interesting that you should bring up part of that research that was done looking specifically on the impact of Ebola. I believe the Melinda Gates Foundation, the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation also did extensive work on it. And similarly, in the same ways that you are speaking about how the level of expectation and burden on women increases during a time such as this, we also know that much of that work, much of that labor will often never be rewarded. So it will often never come with money attached to it. And speak to me about the role of that in extending the inequality gap that exists between men and women, and what it does in particular for women who are part of the informal economy, who find themselves now in a position where they're either unable to work in the way that they have before.
So two things, and let me start with your last point. The first issue is that there's some research that was done by someone called Zamazima, amongst others, through MISTRA, the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflections, where when she spoke earlier today, she also mentioned the fact that when you looked at the special COVID grant, it largely went to men in South Africa. And yet when you look at who has carried the burden of care work and unpaid care work, it's predominantly been women. So there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between the carers, caregivers, and the grant provision. And it's quite important that during times like this, that there is a social safety net that can support families, that can support the caregivers, and so on. There's also a global movement around the need to recognize unpaid work. And probably this is the moment that there's a possibility to place this higher up on the agenda. Because as I also serve as chair of the Committee of Experts on Public Administration, and when we met in April of last year, one of the experts from France actually made the point around these invisible, low-paid workers. And if you look at the reality of economies, these are the people who are almost most dependent upon during this period. So that's the one point I want to make. The second point that I want to make, and I'm going to link it to the issue of Ebola as well, but let me start out at a different, from a different vantage point. We had, in addition to Professor Lenka Bula, the new Puleng Lenka Bula, the new principal and vice chancellor of the University of South Africa. I mean, she spoke and put out a challenge around what should be done and how we deal with these issues of the roles of women in the economy and so on. And in addition to her, there was also Professor Jomo Sundaram from Malaysia, who spoke about the need, and both of them spoke to this issue of having a whole of society and a whole of government response. You can't only look at the economy, you can't only look at health and public health. You need to look holistically at the response, and everybody needs to be involved in this. So coming back to the issue of Ebola, at the time when it was in Liberia, Guinea-Conakry, and Sierra Leone, I actually happened to be with the African Development Bank. And at that point, at the height of Ebola, Dr. Donald Kabaruka, the then head of the African Development Bank, the head of the WHO, and myself as part of a delegation went into these countries, because at that point there was quite a push globally to isolate these countries and to avoid flights in and out of these countries. And we said, if you don't open these countries up, if you close these economies, it's going to create greater hardships. The women in those economies communicated with us and said, look, we need you to come because we need interventions post the pandemic, because market women in the informal sector was very largely impacted. Their livelihoods were taken away. There was no access for them to any other form of support. Similarly, when you look at what's happened in various countries, and this was raised today, We as a country have also, like many other developing countries, except for East Asia and South Asia, we've looked at the West. And as was pointed out, their responses from the outset was wrong. And it has led to a locking down of economies, which is very problematic because we shouldn't have a false dichotomy between lives and livelihoods. At the end of the day, it's marginalized people, it's women who are in the informal economy, and they get almost a double whammy when you have closures that doesn't take into account how you deal with this dichotomy.
Sure.
Over to you, Kathy.
The trustee of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there for tonight. Thanks for coming on to the show. Well,